What's up, everybody? It's Ollie from FlightComp. This is old school Dragonfly build video number 5, I think. We're still working on our DCU Dragonfly slope glider, and I'm gonna go ahead and start painting or priming and painting the fuselage. So I've done some prep. I've sanded the whole thing with 220 grit all over and taped off the canopy area and just made myself this little kind of carrying handle out of a piece of wire just so I can hold on to it while I paint it and not get my hands all covered in paint. So that's ready to go basically. And then I have the canopy here and I've just taped a stick to it so I can hold on to it while I paint it. Again, this is also sanded with 220 grit sandpaper. Now this is going to require, I think, multiple coats of primer because there's tons of pinholes and voids and stuff in here. And I'll probably even have to break out a little bit of Bondo to fill some of the bigger holes in here because there is no surface coat. Now I wanted to talk about paint preparation on a part like this. If you're dealing with a fiberglass part that doesn't have a really smooth surface finish, like a paint finish or a gel coat, and need to do a lot of filling and sanding for paint, I highly recommend you get yourself some really good polyester high fill primer. You can pick this up at any automotive paint shop, even some normal like auto parts stores like Kragen or O'Reilly or whatever the hell they're called where you live. Sometimes they'll have this in the paint department. It's a two-part paint, so it's catalyzed. It is polyester based, just like polyester resin, and you get that little small tube of clear liquid. That's the catalyst. And you can thin this out and clean up with acetone. Now, you're going to need something to spray this with, and I know you're going to think, well, I don't want to get a compressor and a spray gun and all that. Well, you don't need to. Just go to Home Depot or your hardware store and get yourself one of these little guys. This is a Preval just spray system. It's just like a CO2 canister with a screw-on jar, so you can mix up some paint and spray it out here. Now, this is not going to give you as good of a finish as a spray gun, so I wouldn't really recommend spraying your color coat or clear coats or anything with this, but for primer, it's really great and quick way to do it. So again, I'm going to use this primer here, and I'm going to thin it out about 10% with acetone. And I'm going to spray on one really heavy coat as my first coat, just to fill as many of the imperfections as possible. If I get runs and drips and whatever, doesn't really matter because this stuff is super easy to sand. It sands off like butter. It doesn't clog your sandpaper. Just do yourself a favor. If you're going to do any work like this, just throw that primer in a spray can in the garbage. Get yourself some of this. It might cost you a few dollars more, but you're going to save a bunch of time and hassle when it comes to actually sanding, because this is just going to sand way better than any of that spray primer stuff in a spray can. So let's put a coat of this onto our fuselage and canopy. Alright everybody, I've put the primer down on this Dragonfly fuselage. I have just drowned this sucker in primer. You can see I have runs all over, and I don't care because I'm just trying to fill as much of the as many of the pinholes and everything else as possible. And let me just show you, this thing is covered in pinholes and bubbles. Look at that. Basically everywhere on the fuselage there's pinholes. You can see them on the sides here. I would say this primer probably covered half, but there's still a ton left. Got the canopy here. Canopy's not so bad, but there's still some pinholes on it. So, before I get into sanding this primer off, I'm going to just basically lather this thing up with some body filler. And I'm going to put it on as thin as I can, and, I don't want to glob it on too thick because you're going to have to end up sanding most of it off anyway, but we're going to put it on and let it dry, and then we can get to sanding. So here's what I'm going to use. This is a glazing and spot putty. It's not the big tub of Bondo. And just a spreading tool and some hardener. And I'm just going to mix on a piece of cardboard. This stuff is a little thinner and creamier than what you'd find in a tub of body filler. So it's easier to apply. And I think for doing, a model fuselage, this is the way to go. And this stuff's going to kick off pretty quick, so just mix up small amounts at a time and just move along the fuselage, as you go, and don't try to cover the whole thing in one shot and mix up a bunch of Bondo. Just work in spots and don't run into problems with the filler kicking off on you before you get it onto the fuselage. Look at how much filler I've put on everything. Here's the canopy. It's basically got filler on most areas. And here's the fuselage. Just covered. Just covered. So we have a really thick layer of primer and some of this filler, and then when this filler starts drying off, I'm going to sand it with some 100 grit very lightly and then switch over to 220 grit. And I'll probably end up sanding most of everything off just to get most of the things filled, and then we'll have to reapply more primer. So I've sanded a lot of the primer off with 220 grit sandpaper. As you can see here, it was a pretty heavy application of primer, so there was a lot of material to remove. And you can see the spots where the filler filled up all the imperfections in the fuselage. Some more there. I've done the canopy as well. So now what I'm going to do is apply another coat of primer, and I'm going to do it much thinner, and I'm just going to try to get a uniform gray surface over this, and we will do a little bit of sanding after that coat of primer is dry, but not much. And then we can move on to actually putting some color on this. Okay, so I've put another coat of primer on the fuselage and the canopy. It's a thinner coat, more uniform, no runs or drips. And tried to get even coverage all over. And now what I'm going to do is wet sand this with some 600 grit sandpaper and some water. I'm going to try not to remove all the primer, as in I don't really want to try to expose any of the fiberglass. I just want to smooth out the surface and get it ready for the color coat of paint. So I have the fuselage and canopy wet sanded with the 600 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to wipe these down with some alcohol to get all the dust and residue off. And I went to the local hobby shop and picked up a can of Tamiya spray paint. Seems to match the gray somewhat closely. I looked through the selection of paint, and this seemed to be the closest match to the covering here. Light ghost gray. It's alright if it's not the perfect match. At some point I just got to get this thing done and not be a perfectionist about things. After I spray this onto the parts, well, this is going to go black, but the fuselage will be gray. And then after I spray this, I will clear coat both these parts and polish them out. So I'm pretty sure the clear coat will kind of change this color slightly. But, I think it'll be good enough. So let's move on with putting some color on these parts. Alright, I jumped ahead a few steps just because I really want to get this plane done, and videoing every step takes a lot of time. But I actually painted the fuselage and the canopy, and also I put several coats of clear coat on top. So there's the canopy, And here's the fuselage. I am going to color sand and polish these parts, so the finish isn't the greatest. They're dusty too, but there's a little bit of orange peel and a run right there. But I'll get rid of that and polish these up. And unfortunately, not a perfect match color-wise with the covering. I have to say that the color of this gray turned out a little bit different than the top of the can. Top of the can is pretty close. I would say the top of the can's like in between these two colors. So this came out a little darker, or almost bluer than what I would like. But, you know, I'm over it. I hope you guys are over it too. We just got to push ahead, get this thing done, because it's been like 10 years, it feels like, of working on this. So I'm just going to color sand and polish these parts. Then I'm going to take all the tape off, and we can move on to hooking up the elevator, gluing the tail on, and we'll be one step closer to flying. Alright, look at the shine I was able to get on these parts after color sanding and polishing. Looking pretty good, I must say. Pretty happy with the way they came out. Got the canopy and the fuselage. And I think what I'm going to do is just get the horizontal and the vertical glued up to the fuselage, and then we'll call it good on this video. And then on the next video, I think we will have this thing completely buttoned up. Alright, I scuffed up the fuselage here where the horizontal is going to get glued on, and I've trimmed back the covering on the horizontal. Now I have to glue the horizontal onto the fuse and make sure it's level with the wings, and it's also parallel this way. Alright, I got the elevator glued on, or the horizontal stab, and I've cut a little strip of monocoat here of the covering to get ready to glue the rudder on, and I've ground the paint down to the fiberglass on the fuselage, and I'm going to try to get this vertical on here somewhat aligned. Have a little piece of tape here marking where the tip of the vertical should go. I think I'm just going to work on the front here first and then go back to the back, but getting this on straight and square is going to be a little bit of a challenge. I'll use this to help me. I'll see how it goes. So I managed to get the vertical just tacked in place. It's basically just glued along this front edge, and I have a tack here. And then this isn't in the kit or in the plans, but I used some triangle stock, some balsa triangle stock. Just sanded it a little bit and covered it, and I'm going to use that back here basically like this, just to support the vertical because there's not much holding it in place. So I'm just going to trim up a little bit of this covering and then glue these guys in, and then that basically wraps up the majority of the construction. There's the tail, it's on, it's all buttoned up. Still have to do the hinges on the elevator and put a control horn in, but I think the little balsa fillets came out pretty good. And really, for the first time, we can kind of see the whole plane put together. So here's what it looks like. DCU Dragonfly, looking pretty good. I need to come up with some kind of canopy retention system, and I did install the Bluebird 125 WV servo in the servo tray, but there's no push rod hooked up yet. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think we made a lot of decent progress on the Dragonfly, and I think in the next video it's going to be totally buttoned up and ready to fly. So I don't know if we'll fly in the next video, but we'll have all the surfaces hinged and the servos hooked up, a canopy installed, a receiver battery, and all that good stuff. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.